to remind people, because I know people want to maybe comment on some of the issues, there's plenty of time for discussion. We'll take our speakers and then we'll come back out to the audience to see who wants to raise questions or make contributions. So I'm going to now just introduce Zita Holbourne, and just to personally thank Zita, who was also willing to step and chair the meeting. I didn't make it in time. It was a bit of an issue. Won't go into it here, but thanks again, Zita. But fortunately, she's here able to speak on the issues that are very important. We spent a lot of time here so far talking about jobs. Quite rightly, we're at TUC conference, but there is another element of the climate crisis, the creation of refugees. Bill spoke about the North African oasis. Zita's work is going to be very much focused on that. Zita's on the PCS National Executive, the TUC Race Relations Committee, and is one of the original co-founders of BARAC. So let me hand over to you, Zita.
Just to explain what BARAC is, for those that might not know, I'm sure some people here do. It's Black Activists Rising Against Cuts. We were founded in 6 years ago. I'm the co-founder of that organisation, which is focused on campaigning against the disproportionate impact of austerity on black workers, but also on the injustice and racism that black communities face under the Tory government in particular. So I was at the COP21 conference, and PCS organised a session which I spoke at on the links between climate change, refugees and migration. And there are countries that, for the people that live in them, they're actually facing climate change issues their entire lifetimes. That doesn't go away. It's not something that's just there temporary. It's going to affect them for their whole lives, and they have to face the adversity, because of it throughout their lives. And climate poverty has a link with illegal wars and Western intervention, because some of those the conditions that people are in lead to poverty, lead to people having to flee rural areas and overcrowding in cities, and then people being displaced. But we also have to remember historically that colonial rule and empire means that a lot of the countries that are particularly impacted by poverty and climate change were countries that were stripped of their resources by Western countries during those times. So for the last year, I've been coordinating aid convoys to Calais and Dunkirk. And that made me actually, because sitting down and speaking to people about what they'd been through and why they had left their countries of origin, made me became a lot more aware of the climate issues that they were facing, and actually linked to, persecution, war, poverty was climate change for the vast majority of people that are like in Calais and Dunkirk. And Sudan, there's a huge Sudanese community in Calais, and they're the largest African country, and obviously it's an arid country, so with desert, so they're impacted there. Syria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Afghanistan have been impacted by drought, and actually in Afghanistan contrasting between floods and droughts. So these conditions mean that people have to leave rural areas, and as I said, go into overcrowded cities, deepening poverty, and then when they are fleeing their countries and trying to come to the UK or other European countries, they're demonised and labels, while Western countries are not thinking about what have they done to create the conditions, whether it's historically or more recently, for people having to flee. And land rights, which we haven't got time to go in here, is another whole issue that I think that we need to look at in any climate change campaigning that we're doing. And those that are seeking refuge because of those conditions, they're dehumanised. We've heard all the wicked things that people are called, swarms and so on. And the UK trying to reject anybody that's fleeing those things and saying, well, they're not classified as a refugee, they don't meet the criteria, and therefore we don't need to do anything about them. And actually they're economic migrants that are coming here to take all our jobs, to try and shift the blame from the Tories for austerity and scapegoat and scaremonger. And that has a knock-on impact, not just on those migrating to the UK recently, because we've seen the Immigration Act that's sought to create an apartheid-like state. And actually, for those of us that are even the second generation, like myself, even third generation, that has an impact. So anybody that's deemed to be a migrant or the children of migrants are tarnished under that same brush. So I think that in terms of what we're doing as trade unionists to campaign on climate change issues, we have to link that up with the campaigns that we're doing on anti-fascism, for migrant rights and refugee rights, and actually austerity as well, because there is an interlink. The UN says that refugees, wherever they're placed, should have a link with host communities and access to local infrastructure and services. And of course that doesn't happen. Of course they haven't even got that link in Calais. They're completely cut off and demonised. They're in a shanty town. It's not a government-sponsored camp. And so they certainly don't have access to employment rights or jobs. And of course, when they seek asylum here, if they get here in the first place, they don't have that access. And that has a knock-on impact in terms of, economic equity going forward. So last week we saw in Calais the blockade, and that was only stopped when the government gave an assurance that they would clear and demolish the entire Calais camp all in one go, in one step. And there's a motion on children, refugee children, because there's a lot of children that are alone in the camp in Calais that should be brought to the UK under the Dubs Amendment and are not given that right. So that leads to deepening poverty. It leads to a whole other generation facing poverty. And with the Immigration Act, John McDonnell has said that under a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, they would repeal the Immigration Act, but the Immigration Act is impacting on people now and people's rights to migrate and flee climate change issues. And just this week, I just wanted to highlight, I'm sure I'm about to run out of time, that last week, I don't know how many of you are aware that a specially chartered private plane forcibly removed 42 Jamaican nationals from the UK. And it's something that, if I come in on a debate tomorrow, I will talk about in more detail. There's barely any news coverage of what happened to those 42 people. There were actually 50 people. They were rounded up in 2 weeks. They were actually people that have come to the UK as children or as babies or have been here for decades, have British-born partners, children and so on. And they've just been rounded up. So that's another issue. So we're talking about, trying to get to the UK. You get here and you think you're settled here and you've got your children and grandchildren here. You've been here for decades. The next minute, within 2 weeks, you're detained and stuck on a plane and sent out of the country. And then you have to appeal from out of the country rather than being able to conclude your appeal process here in the UK. So I think we do need to look at all of those issues around the Immigration Act. And the other thing that I think we need to do, interestingly, I have a lot of debates and discussion about airport expansion and climate change with my son, because he works in the aviation industry. He's actually an aviation analyst. But before that, he worked in an airport as a flight turnaround coordinator, so he's got a very different opinion on it. If you look at the airport, the London airport that he worked in, the majority of the workers are young black and migrant workers, so we have to look at that as well from a race perspective and an equality perspective when we're considering climate jobs, I believe. And most of you would have seen that Black Lives Matter did a protest in City Airport the other day, and whatever you think about their approach and what they did, how they did it, actually young black activists in the UK and the new black movements of young black activists are looking at climate change and are considering it. And I think one of the key things we need to do is very much in the UK a white movement, yeah? So we need to change that. We need to involve, need to have more diversity. We need to involve indigenous people. We need to involve migrants and refugees and black people, because we're the ones that are disproportionately impacted when you look at climate change globally. and obviously I'm using black in the political sense. So I think it's really important that actually if the climate change movement was more linked up with the Black Lives Matter movement, perhaps there would have been more of a discussion and about what to do strategically and how to go about doing it. Actually, I have got links with Black Lives Matter movement, but I didn't know, and some of the video they recorded was recorded at an event the day before where I was the keynote speaker. I didn't know anything about it, so that's told me actually I need to have those conversations with my contacts within that movement. But it's really important that we come together and those that are most impacted have a voice, that we're not talking about people, we're involving them and allowing them to lead the movement. Unfortunately, the next generation young people are the ones that are inheriting all of these issues, so they have to be able to have a leading role and a clear voice in anything and everything we do. Thank you.